Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Ruppert from the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. There are going to be two labels that say Paul Ruppert today. We've had some technical issues, and we are welcoming Jon Pelson, who is the author of a book called Wireless Wars, to the connectivity brief today. Hello, Jon. How are you?
I'm doing good, Paul. How are you?
I'm doing okay, notwithstanding the technical issues. So thank you for your patience, as well as the audience's patience. I also happen to have a cough, so we'll work through this as we can. Sorry about that. So everybody, we're privileged to have a guest like Jon today because we're going to be talking about what was going on in the 2000s and 2010s relative to 4G and 5G development and the transition between those two, and the positioning of Huawei as well as let's say the Chinese industrial complex against the American industrial complex, which is the nature of these wireless wars, if you will, in terms of infrastructure selling, sales, and emplacement of these networks across all the world. Jon is uniquely suited to be able to discuss this, and I'm going to leave it to Jon to give his backstory and the overall perspective of the conclusions of his book, and then we'll go from there relative to questions and a dialogue between the two of us. Jon, over to you.
Sure. So I've got an unusual background for what I'm doing now. I worked as a telecom executive for more than 25 years, generally in disruptive technologies. So that was through the 90s and beyond. That generally meant wireless. And I worked with Lucent, British Telecom, Nextel, and other companies, generally helping introduce disruptive technologies in the wireless space to the world. Did some work in China and decided a few years ago to write a book about, it was going to be a business book, how China had basically taken the technology that was invented by Bell Labs and Motorola and Nortel, and basically either developed or stole the core IP, and was able to seize the entire network equipment market from the leaders. So the companies that made up 90% of the market, Nortel, Motorola, Lucent, Alcatel, Siemens, these guys all basically went out of business, and you're left with Nokia and Ericsson. And what started as a business book, because I live in Washington area, I was lucky enough to run into, basically, I ran into a FBI counter-intel officer who ran the Huawei team. And I said, why would you have a team at the FBI for Huawei? And he asked, where does Huawei have its cellular towers in the US? And I said, they can't sell equipment to any of the big guys. And AT&T won't buy it, Verizon, just mom and pop independent carriers in the middle of nowhere, Montana, North Dakota. And he said, well, what's in Montana? What's in North Dakota? And I said, well, fly fishing, I guess, and nice forests. And he said, no, all of our nuclear missile bases are served by Huawei cellular gear. So was Special Operations Command, the Groton's nuclear subbase. And this was news to me, having made a career in this space and having already started researching the book. I was shocked to hear this, and I found it, of course, was true. And Huawei had deployed the gear at giveaway prices. It didn't make any economic sense. And so the book really took a different turn. Wireless Wars became really a study of geopolitical power as waged through technology markets. And I focused on the wireless market, not exclusively, but certainly that was my main push. And what I really wrote about was how we're engaged now in war by other means against China. And our biggest problem is if we think this is business competition, and why are they pricing like this? Why did they steal that IP? They're not doing it to make money. Well, but it's a private for-profit company. Doesn't matter. I mean, the Chinese government, the CCP, has put over $100 billion into one company, Huawei. Now, you're never going to get that money back. You can make them a dominant player. You're still not going to make more than $100 billion in current value of income. So why would they do it? They're doing it so that every factory, every defense department, every company, every financial market is sitting on a Huawei network or can be compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. And they've been very effective at it, very successful. So really since then, since the book came out, I've spent my time divided between advising corporate entities and government organizations and agencies on how to deal with the technology threat from China.
Yeah, you and our paths crossed about 4 years ago after you published your book. I read it, and you were gracious enough to reply back to my email to you, where I was relaying to you my own experience of living and working in China in 2005, where I was there for 9 months. I closed a deal with China Mobile and China Unicom at the same time, which required me to be on the ground and operating from China. So I that really resonated with me in that perspective. So let's step one step back, away from, let's say, the warfare, but why is the transition from 4G to 5G important to us?
Yeah, well, one of the points that I emphasize is that it's not just about communications. Now, communications is incredibly important, but people say, so do you think China can spy on our phone calls? Well, yeah, although they can even do that through an Ericsson or Nokia network they've shown with Salt Typhoon hack, which was a massive hack of the entire American telecom network. But it's more than just telecom.
And if you will, just explain that very briefly, because the audience is quite varied in terms of even on there in the telecom space. They
Sure.
might not have the discrete appreciation of what that impact was.
Salt Typhoon is a hack from one of the persistent threat actors in China, it's believed, where a few years ago they tapped into a network which is used for lawful wireless and wireline intercept. So in the United States, as in any free democratic country, people have individual liberties and rights, but under court order, for certain circumstances, you can tap into someone's phone. And those systems are designed very specifically so that the person or entity can't detect that they're being observed, they're being listened in on, eavesdropped on. So it's a very powerful tool. And in fact, there's a phrase, don't ever forge a sword so powerful you wouldn't give it to your worst enemy. Well, we created a technology and required it where you can listen in on anybody with a court order and they'll never have any way of knowing that you're doing it. Well, we forged that sword and China seized it. They were able to hack into the system and listen to probably any phone call, wireless or wireline, probably wireline transmissions for data, emails, and among other catastrophic implications, and there's so many, they even get to see, because it's a lawful intercept, who do we know about as a spy? Which Chinese actors in the U.S. are being observed and which ones are not? Okay, so you know who's been made, who's been detected, and who hasn't, because they're not on the wireless intercept list. So this was catastrophic. It's not necessarily over yet. It's not clear that it's totally out of the system. It's very hard to root out. And so you see, hacks like that are incredibly damaging. And not only can they listen in there, but if you look at the point of 5G, which you asked about, versus 4G, 4G is a communications medium. 5G is not just a faster 4G. There's no one who's ever looked at a phone with 5 bars and said, sure, 50 megabits per second is fine to my handset, but I really need 500 megabits for what I'm trying to do right now. There's just no such thing. The real value of 5G is traits like low latency, high capacity that lets you, say, rig up a factory with 10,000 sensors in a small area where a 4G network would overload. But you can put 10,000, 100,000 sensors and get very low latency responses. So you've rigged up your pharmaceutical factory. You've got temperature sensors every 10 feet along the line. You've got optical readers that are doing visual inspection. All this is terrific and can't be done wireline because factories are becoming much more flexible. They need to be able to switch on the fly. You can't really use Wi-Fi. It's not secure. It's not, the latency isn't good enough. And so 5G is an answer. And if China owns 5G, that means that in a time of conflict, and I would consider a tariff war even a time of conflict, you don't have to be shooting. If they have the ability to slow or throttle or shut our factories, our pharmaceutical factories, our automobile factories, just by cutting off the communications links, that's an enormous power to have. And America moved very quickly, unusually, to try and intercept Huawei's influence in the world and was able to do that with, I think, some success at the end of the first Trump administration, throughout the Biden administration, and continuing today in the second Trump administration.
And to be clear here, this isn't just about anti-China issues. Let's be clear about that. This is as much about what transpired within those companies that you talked about, Lucent, Nortel, et cetera, because there was a lot of poor business decision making, which you even cover in your book. So why don't you illuminate that a little bit?
Yeah, well, first of all, people that say we're attacking Huawei because we just want to be our own, support our own success. Too late on that. Everyone that would compete against Huawei in America is out of business. So I don't know that America is going to do heavy statecraft to help the Finns. Nokia is they're an ally. I think they're now a NATO ally, but we're not pulling out all stops and beating on China to help the Finn economy grow, or the Swedish economy with Ericsson. Those are the only two players. So how do we get into this mess? There were a lot of boneheads at the American telecom companies. Nortel couldn't complete its books. They couldn't submit financials for years. Terrible mismanagement that went on there. And by the way, Admiral Bill Owens, who took over the company, former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he wasn't responsible for Nortel's crisis, although he certainly didn't get them out of it. And he moved on to do a lot of work for the Chinese Communist Party after that. So you can draw your own conclusions on that. Motorola, terrible decisions. I outline them in the book. They didn't think digital communications were going to become a big thing, and they didn't bother moving into it until they were way too late. And so you got Motorola, Nortel, and Lucent, who I talk about. We were building a $70 million private golf course in the late 90s for the use of our CEO and his corporate friends. Supposedly the customers would come play there. Meanwhile, Huawei was building a $90 million research facility in Bangalore. And which one has a better return to the shareholders? So American companies screwed it up pretty good. You're still muted there, but American companies did screw it up pretty good.
Where is the golf course?
I've played it. It is a beautiful golf course.
Okay.
It is now
So
called
I play golf, and I'm wondering where this is.
It's called Hamilton Farm. It's not far from Trump National, ironically, if we talk about American politics.
In Virginia?
Nope. The other Trump National up in New Jersey near Bedminster.
Okay.
And it's 18 holes, and then there's also a par 3 golf course. It is a beautiful course that should never be done on the shareholder dime of a huge company like Lucent. That's a private deal. And
yeah, I'm sure it was sold off at loss. And
sold
now
for
it's
$1.
doing very well. Oh gosh. Okay.
Sold for $1 and a note, saying just get it off our books and take it.
Well, okay. So back to the topic at hand. The reality in capitalism relative to it competing against communism, or at least state-oriented capitalism. As Vladimir Ilyich Lenin said, the capitalists will sell us the rope in which we hang them. So that has an impact in this entire discussion, doesn't it?
It does. And this is where people say the American companies should have thought ahead. They should have avoided going into China, where they would turn over their IP and really compromise the companies. There is truth to that. However, it's not so simple. Take, for example, my company. If Lucent did not move its manufacturing and much of its R&D into China, because we're going to be an American company, we're worried about security. Okay. But if Ericsson did, or Alcatel, or Nokia, then what the customers like AT&T and Verizon would have said is, well, you're selling your system, Lucent. You just bid $100 million on this build out. Ericsson just bid $30 million for the same thing, and it's just as good, and they're a trusted vendor. And Lucent would have gone out of business very, very quickly for that reason too. So as long as anyone can make things in a better, cheaper, more competitive environment, then everyone has to, or you go out of business. So you've got to have a blanket ban. If you say this is not a trusted environment, then you have to say no one can go there. And there's a huge incentive for cheaters, of course. Anyone who does go there, take advantage of China's very smart, hardworking engineers and the fantastic supply chain ecosystem that China developed. It's not just cheap people, it's smart, hardworking people in a really well managed ecosystem of suppliers.
Yeah, you really don't get a sense of that until you get there. And, the first trip that I ever went to China was in 2001. And suffering from jet lag in a five-star hotel, I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and construction was going on full bore right next door on another building. You'll never see that in any of the Western nations, but that's what the pace and force in which they were developing their economy and still are trying to do that. And let's not be naive here in the sense that um, sovereign interests and national focus have been employed by the U.S. in the past in World War II, where we marshaled our industry for a non-profit or a non-return gain, if you will. And there are, even in the world of techno-politics, the reality is that the GSM standards that we have been operating now under for over a decade were a force and an output of the European Union for I should say, a technical reason for roaming. So this is not a isolated event in terms of, let's call it, geopolitical technopolitics that we talked about earlier. It's just a matter, in this case, it had substantial circumstances as a result. So we didn't sit idly by. Again, this is like 4 or 5 years ago since your book was published. During the first Trump administration, there was an initiative, I think it was called the Clean Network Act, that was promoted by Keith Krach, who is the founder and former CEO of DocuSign. And ironically, you're on his institute board, the Krach Institute, and even more ironically, he's a high school classmate of mine. And given that, let's get back to the core. Tell the audience relative to the Clean Network Act and what Keith was doing to be able to marshal interests amongst our allies across the world with that.
Sure, he was an assistant undersecretary of commerce, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to get his
state. Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs and Environment, I think, is the technical title. He was the number two at the State Department.
That's right, and working closely with many people in commerce. And what he did, it's what you would hope your public servants do at the top levels. He said, "We've got to use America clout and influence in the world to, as I talked about, get an agreement. We're not going to deploy these networks. We're not going to buy this equipment. And we wanted to have this network of dozens and dozens of countries that had clean networks. They were not infiltrated by equipment that has repeatedly been found to be compromised." And the examples, people say, what proof is there? British Telecom, while I was there, deployed Huawei into their big 21st century network. This was in the early 2000s. And they spent billions of dollars on Huawei switches, servers, and found all sorts of chatter going on with them. And what that means is there was a certain volume of traffic they should have been handling, and yet they were seeming to handle far more traffic. In other words, they were taking information and they were sending it off somewhere that there was no explanation for. And the only explanation for that is that they're exfiltrating important data, user data, or even phone calls and communications to be decrypted or analyzed. Has that ever been proven? Well, BT spent billions to forklift out the equipment and replace it. So I guess it's not technically proven, but you don't throw money like that away. You don't spend $1 billion on a hunch or a risk or a possibility. You spend it because you, as a company, believe we've been compromised. Now, across Europe, the Clean Network Act efforts were intended to get allies, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, the Nordic countries, to just get Huawei totally out of the network. And to be fair, it has not been completely successful. Germany still has Huawei in its 5G networks. And China wields enormous influence. They said, I talk about this in Wireless Wars, they said, well, banning Huawei in your network, we would never, for example, ban Volkswagen in China because you sell more cars in China than the rest of the world combined, including Germany. We would never, the ambassador said, we would never think of such a thing now, would we? So, in other words, there's the threat. Nice car you have in front of your business. It would be a shame if it were to catch fire while you were parking it there one night. How much do you want to pay for fire insurance? So China has been able to wield a lot of influence. And in fact, there was a story I commented on recently where Spain has decided to deploy Huawei into its National Intelligence Services network. And they're using China for its lawful wireless intercept. You don't need to worry about China coming in the back door when you've given them the keys to the front door. They literally have deployed the lawful intercept network in Spain. So it's not been a complete success, but I got to give Keith credit for having made the most progress on that issue that anyone has to date.
Indeed. Quite remarkable that notwithstanding the positioning of the issue and Huawei's engagement, that's all anchored in a Chinese company, that the Spanish intelligence services would be utilizing that. Quite remarkable. So the reality is that if we take a snapshot today, there's been no rip or remove of the software that's been implemented in the networks across the globe. There's a lot of froth and smoke around the issue, but no real action has been taken. Is that the case?
It's some action's been taken, some gains have been made, some losses have been realized, and I'll tell you, here's where you really sum it up. The U.S. situation with Huawei surrounding our nuclear missile bases and others, Congress jumped on that and funded billions of dollars to what they called the Rip and Replace program. Tear out the Huawei gear and replace it with trusted equipment. And years later, it's mostly still in place. It is incredible to think that we still have Huawei gear looking down on our nuke bases today, years after we identified the problem. And part of that is because of the way things work on the Hill. Congress voted the money, and they said, we don't want these companies to take advantage of Uncle Sam and upgrade their equipment with this payment. So we'll put $5 billion aside to buy out their old Huawei gear and pay for the new Ericsson gear. But if they have 3G Huawei, they have to put in brand new 3G Ericsson, or 4G Huawei. They have to put in brand new 4G Ericsson or Nokia. I don't even know if Nokia and Ericsson are selling 4G equipment anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
And the funny thing is, even if they are, the nuke bases, the military bases, don't want 4G. They want 5G because it's more secure. Sure. And yet Congress passed the law saying you have to do like for like. And that's been one of the reasons that they've been handcuffed. And these local companies are saying, we don't have the money. We're small mom and pop. We can't just spend money to replace everything unless you pay for it. And we're still hung up on that. It is appalling how we've been paralyzed on this.
Well, and so the next question obviously is all of the discussion around AI, and that AI is essentially a strategic interest of the United States in being able to frame it, forge it, create it, build it, implement it, etc. We are essentially competing against the Chinese versions and the Chinese initiatives in that context. Where do we stand relative to that competition?
I mean, this is the paradox of the current administration. I love policies like shutting down TikTok that the administration's put forward and blocking the sale of high-end H20 and other AI chips to China. That's the administration's stand. I hate policies like leaving TikTok running and allowing the sale of AI chips to China, which is also where the administration stands. It's been maddening to see great programs advanced, including, I think it's important to withhold the most sophisticated AI chipsets from China, which has been the policy, and yet here we are now allowing them, and for all the wrong reasons. The idea is this will make American companies more dominant and influential in the world. We need to look at this not as a corporate competition, but as a geopolitical battle. My book isn't called Wireless Competition. It's called Wireless Wars for a reason. This really is war by other means, which means don't sell your most advanced technology to someone who sees us as an enemy. And they do. China sees us not as a competitor. They see us as an enemy.
Right. And, it begs the question, how many technology executives have ever read Clausewitz on war, which is essentially war by, politics by other means. And this is another way of being able to express politics by another means. Politics being essentially geopolitical interests, real politics, as Henry Kissinger would talk about it. But that gets into an entirely different realm than our mutual careers in this space. So, what is your long-term outlook, essentially, on Western competitiveness, specifically U.S. competitiveness, in the face of China's continued tech investment and advancement, and therefore influence?
Yeah, you have to first accept that China is really good. Their engineers are smart, they work hard, companies have deep pockets, they invest well. And then they've got these force multipliers, which really help them even more. So while there's disadvantages that China faces, which I'll talk about, the advantages they have is on top of this huge number of smart engineers that are well trained, between government directed funding, even at a loss, where they'll never make the money back because it's for national security purposes, national projection of power. They've got all this funding, and they've got the willingness to steal IP. Not just, I shouldn't say willingness, the urgency to steal IP. Bonuses are paid out to employees who can come back with IP that's protected, that they've been able to get past and get their hands on. So those are force multipliers. When you have that leg up, it makes you even that much more competitive. And I'm not talking about reverse engineering, which is a legitimate business approach that companies do, and they should do. You buy the competitor's product, see how they're doing it, see what's protected and what's not, and you do everything that you're allowed to without going to jail. They don't have that risk. You don't see the people in China being dragged off for IP theft. We don't have proper enforcement in the U.S. When they completely ripped off the Cisco server platform, and a team from Cisco flew out there and met with Ron Zhengfei, the chairman and founder of Huawei, and they laid out how they had stolen all the code. I mean, the comments in the code, embedded in the code, did not sound like they were written in Shanghai.
It's a great anecdote. Exactly. Even the misspellings or the miscoding errors.
Yep. There were the typos in the manual were the same in China. You had comments saying, "This is a really gnarly problem, dude. Here's how I'm solving it." Written into the code. Sounds more California to me than Beijing or Shenzhen. But they presented it to Ron Zhengfei, and he looked at it, and finally he just said, "Coincidence. We happen to have the same typos in our manual that you had in yours, and the code looks the same, and the product has the same bugs and problems." So this is a problem when you have that. Now, what's
And
our
if I may, let's again be very clear here and transparent. This is not new, not necessarily in China or by China, but in terms of nation-to-nation competition. In the 1780s, American entrepreneurs, let's call them that, were essentially stealing mills out of the UK and shipping them off to North Carolina, which was the basics of the cornerstone of the American textile industry for the next 150 years. So this is not done in isolation. It's not like we are pure as the driven snow here. This is just a matter of geopolitical, real business initiatives. And when it comes down to this kind of competition, no holds barred, so to speak.
Well, it's absolutely true, and it is. I don't want to say ironic. It's consistent that those looms and mills equipment, textile equipment, were really the precursors of computers.
Mm-hmm.
The very first computers were basically ways to weave certain patterns in an automated way.
Yeah.
Predating electronics, really, in a lot of ways. It was almost like the abacus of computers were the looms. Notwithstanding your point, which is absolutely true, there were Americans that were stealing IP from the technology leader, the UK, England. It didn't make it right. And fortunately for England, the country that was stealing their IP and ripping them off, beyond that, had pretty shared values towards human rights
Of
and
course. Yes.
governance. And one of the big problems we have to remember is that China ripping off from us, okay, this is what happens, what goes around comes around. You do not want to see a world, for all the problems that America may have, you do not want to see a world that is under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. The people in China don't want to be under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, they'd rather not starve, so I get that. But if they could do it without their rights and freedoms being trampled the way they are there, that's what the rest of the world faces if China is the one that the torch gets passed to. So we've got to be realistic. We've had our own. China did not invent IP theft, but they certainly have embedded it into a system that has some pretty worrisome goals in mind.
So given all that we've discussed, there is, I guess this is from Keith's perspective, there are about 20 or 21 different strategic industries relative to strategic technology, and one of them is telecommunications. And I think that was part of the Clean Network Act in terms of the identification of these other 21. And the others include aerospace and battery, electronic vehicles, things of that nature, which ironically, of those 21, most of them are China is leading the pack, so to speak. So given that, the importance of these emerging networks, i.e. 5G and 6G, and eventually 7G, how do we approach this problem?
Yeah.
What kind of policy should we be implementing, since you started the comment on the current administration's policy portfolio?
One of the biggest, one of the most important factors is also one of the trickiest to address, which is standards committees. And I will be the first to tell you that I look at standards committees as a kind of a black magic, arcane world.
I have sat in on those committees early in my career, 20 plus years ago, as an assignment in a 3GPP and 3GPP2. I know where you're going.
Exactly. And, people think in a military analogy, it's exciting to be dropping paratroopers in behind enemy lines and having special forces operators going in and blowing up radio stations and taking out, that's all exciting, but it's logistics, like moving fuel supplies surreptitiously and keeping them secure. That's how you actually win wars. Very, very dull, very difficult, very, very complex. That's kind of what the standards committees are here. So inventing great new technology and all that is fine. But if you haven't had 40 engineers attending these meetings and slipping in rules and requirements and standards that favor your side, you're going to have your lunch eaten. And the big problem is, it's not like they're a collegial environment where everyone goes in there and says, let's just put aside our own interests and see what's good for the industry. They don't. But there's a healthy, kind of a classic market capitalism model where everyone goes in there representing their own needs. But they also say there's this liberal worldview that we're all in this together. If we don't come to a conclusion that makes sense for the market, none of us are going to make money. So you push for your own individual needs, but you give until you say, okay, here's the GSM standard. We're all going to do it. U.S. held off on that and went another way and took a beating as a result. So you do have that as the culture of the standards committees. China does it differently. You will have ZTE and Huawei come to the table with marching orders saying, by the way, they compete ferociously against each other. ZTE is not hand in hand with Huawei. They will steal each other's IP the way they'll steal it from anyone else. They'll undercut them. They hire away their talent. But when they go to the standards committees, they're there as China. And every company at that table from China is working with a goal in mind, which is not their company or the market, it's advance China's cause. And they've been very effective at that because the others are not playing that game.
And to cap that, the reality is that China also fosters the competition within the domestic marketplace. So they essentially make sure that those national interest companies are competing with each other for the market in China because they want to make sure that when they start taking this abroad, that it's the best standard possible, the highest quality capable relative to that type of competition or around that type of technology. I saw that when I was there, and that was 20 years ago. I had the opportunity to go into an innovation zone that was near Shenzhen as part of my work through I got introduced by a China Mobile executive that I knew, and they were trying to foster Silicon Valley, within that context. So 20 years on, they become quite adept into how they want to be able to manifest excellence under their system.
So this is right, and there's a couple really important points in there. One of them is that people say, well, China's just going to go it alone. China 2025, all these programs where they don't need other countries. I think they may actually believe that, or at least Chairman Xi Jinping believes that. Boy, are they wrong. America is by far the biggest economy and the most complex, diversified economy in the world. We can't go it alone. We outsource and offshore all these things to countries, whether it's Germany or the Netherlands or Brazil, anywhere, and we couldn't do it without this global ecosystem. If China thinks they can, it's an arrogance that's going to be their downfall, because there's more. China may be, Huawei is bigger than anyone, but they're not bigger than everyone. Everyone else together has more innovation and cleverness and so on.
Can I turn that back on you in the context of, and you've mentioned this before, that trade is essentially a way to ameliorate tension between nations? Because if you are creating steel for my cars, and if I go off and bomb because of conflict, your steel manufacturing, your steel base, well, I'm going to be essentially hurting myself, which seems to be the posture of the current administration. So given that, the globalized economy that we're all accustomed to has now been turned around because of tariffs, the implementation of tariffs, and the challenging even of our closest allies, i.e. Canada, i.e. the EU, Korea, Japan, etc. How do we turn that to our advantage given these policies that are being implemented?
Yeah, the tariff regime that's underway is 10% brilliant and 90% inexplicable, at least in my opinion. Using tariffs as a geopolitical strategic tool against rivals like China is excellent. If China wants to destroy our electric car industry by dumping a bunch of $19,000 electric cars in the market so that everyone in America ends up driving a car that's being managed out of Shenzhen, and keep that in mind. I gave a talk to an intelligence organization where I said, you don't have to wonder if China has hidden a kill switch in their Volvo plug-in hybrids or electric cars. It's on page 5 of the manual. If your car is ever stolen, notify our security center, give this code, and we will disable the car for you. Well, thank you. What if I don't want you to disable the car, but you do? Well, we can still disable it then too. So there is a worry about that you don't want to lose track of, that there's a certain power that comes with offshoring and outsourcing something like that.
Right. We're coming close to the end of our discussion. How would you wrap this up, given that we've covered so many different angles to this challenge, in the context of, I guess maybe if you were to rewrite your book today, how would you change it, or what different approaches would you take to illuminate this problem?
Yeah, it's interesting. The use of tariffs, it turns out, has been very effective. Now, it's effective at destroying a lot of value. It's been effective at releasing some value. And I didn't really get into that much in the book because it was not really a tool that has been used heavily.
Right.
So I think that whether for right or wrong, it's been done. It's been done with some effect, and I think that's something I would have included more of. And the other thing is just China's ability to innovate. really continues to improve. There's cultural limits that I cite in the book. If you take Jack Ma, who makes one challenging statement in a speech, almost extemporaneous. He just said, you can't regulate digital finance the way you regulate bricks and mortar banks. And they canceled him. They shut him down. My estimate is they cost the Chinese economy close to $1 trillion by canceling his IPOs, removing him from office, from his leadership of these huge companies. And they do it again.
Right.
And knowing the damage, that limits innovation. It really does hurt them. And so I think that's a disadvantage they have. But China continues to get better at innovation, and they're scrappy. They do more with less, which is really what they're best at. They're not best at disruptive breakthroughs because that violates harmony, that undermines established players, and that is not what the Chinese Communist Party wants.
Right.
So we've got to use that to our advantage.
Okay. Well, great. If we have any questions from the audience, we can take them now. I'll have to put them in the Q&A. I don't see anything coming. So, Jon, it's been a pleasure. Really enlightening perspective in terms of your own experience and your suggestions and recommendations in terms of where we should go further. And I hope we might have a follow-up conversation sometime soon.
It's been great joining you here, Paul, and a pleasure being part of this.
Excellent. Have a great day.